The air in the grand ballroom of the St. Regis was thick with the scent of 5,000 imported peonies and the cloying sweetness of expensive champagne. It was the wedding of the century, or so the invitations had boasted. Colette Evans stood near a fluted marble pillar, her hand curved around a crystal flute she hadn't sipped from in 20 minutes. At 55, she was a masterpiece of understated elegance. She wore a midnight navy silk slip dress that draped over her curves like liquid shadow, topped with a structured tuxedo blazer resting over her shoulders. Her hair, a thick mane of salt and pepper curls, was pinned back with a vintage diamond brooch. She looked stunning, but in this room she felt like a ghost. "Colette, there you are." Brenda, her college roommate and the mother of the bride, fluttered over. Brenda was vibrating with the kind of frantic energy only $1 million wedding budget could produce. She grabbed Colette's forearms, her eyes scanning Colette's face with a look that wasn't quite affection. It was a squint of clinical assessment. "You look so healthy, darling," Brenda said, her voice dropping into a tone usually reserved for the bereaved. "And you're here all alone? I told the planners to seat you at the eclectic table. You know, with the cousins and the divorced accountant. I just think it's so brave of you to come to these things without a +1. Colette forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It's a wedding, Brenda, not a battlefield." "Oh, you know what I mean," Brenda sighed, leaning in. "I just worry. I was telling Susan earlier, that big house of yours in Connecticut must be so echoing. Isn't it too big for just you? Maybe it's time to downsize? Get a condo? Somewhere with a gate and a security guard for, well, women of a certain status?" Women of a certain status. The code for the expired. Before Colette could respond, Susan joined them, clutching a gin and tonic. "We were just saying, Colette, when are you going to finally settle down? Or have you just given up? It's okay if you have. Sometimes God just has a different plan for some of us." Colette felt the familiar, cold sting in her chest. It wasn't just the words. It was the way they looked at her, as if she were a tragic figure in a play they had all finished reading years ago. They saw a woman whose best years were a rearview mirror reflection. They saw a poor thing. God forgot my address, Colette thought, the bitterness surprising her. He delivered everyone else's joy, but he must have lost the map to my house. She watched the bride and groom spin on the dance floor, a blur of white tulle and youthful certainty. She looked at her friends, women who stayed in hollow marriages for the sake of the zip code, now pitying her because she had the audacity to be whole and solitary. The invisibility was a physical weight. She was tired of being the strong friend. She was tired of being the expert everyone called for advice, but no one called for dinner. That night, the Connecticut house didn't just feel big, it felt like a tomb. Colette didn't take off her navy dress. She sat at her mahogany desk, the moonlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. She opened her laptop. Her boutique architectural restoration firm was successful, prestigious, and suddenly, utterly suffocating. She saw the email she had archived 3 weeks ago. Subject: RFP, Heritage Restoration Project, Seoul. Confidential. It was a high-risk 6-month contract for JH Group, one of the largest conglomerates in East Asia. They needed an expert to oversee the restoration of a 14th-century palace site being integrated into a modern corporate headquarters. The industry rumors said the CEO of JH Group was a tyrant who had fired 3 previous consultants. Colette's fingers hovered over the keys. Everyone said her time had passed. "Let them be wrong," she whispered to the empty room. In a fever of clarity, she typed a reply. Then she drafted a second email to her junior partner. "I'm selling you my shares. Effective immediately. Keep the clients. Keep the name. I'm taking the archives." By 4 a.m., She had called a high-end estate liquidator. By 7 a.m., she was staring at 3 Toomey suitcases. She wasn't just moving. She was haunting the world that had tried to bury her. 2 days later, Colette stood in the middle of Incheon International Airport. The air was different here. Crisp, smelling of sea salt and jet fuel and possibility. She wasn't a poor thing here. She wasn't Brenda's brave friend. She was a stranger with a formidable mind and nothing left to lose. As she stepped into the black sedan sent to collect her, her phone buzzed with a text from Susan. "Checking in. Did you decide on that condo?" Colette didn't reply. She blocked the number, leaned her head back against the leather seat, and watched the skyline of Seoul rise up like a challenge. The ghost was done haunting. It was time to live. Seoul did not welcome Colette Evans. It merely tolerated her presence. The city was a hyperlapse of neon blue and electric violet, a forest of glass towers that seemed to reach for the stars with jagged, greedy fingers. Standing at the floor-to-ceiling window of her corporate apartment in Gangnam, Colette felt the sheer velocity of the place. It was fast, efficient, and entirely indifferent to her history. In New York, she was the woman who stayed single too long. Here, she was simply a biological entity moving through a sea of 10 million others. Strangely, she found the indifference liberating. On Monday morning, she stood before the mirror, adjusting the lapels of a charcoal gray power suit. She chose a cream silk blouse that softened the sharp lines of the tailoring. Her hair, that defiant silver-shot crown of curls, was swept up into a sleek architectural bun. She didn't use makeup to hide her age. She used it to define her features. She looked like a woman who had seen everything and was unimpressed by most of it. "Ready," she whispered to her reflection. She wasn't going to a date. She was going to war. The headquarters of JH Group was a monolith of black steel and smart glass. As Colette walked through the lobby, the click of her heels on the polished basalt floors sounded like a ticking clock. Inside the 40th floor boardroom, the atmosphere was pressurized. 12 men and 2 women, all in their 30s and early 40s, sat around a table that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of obsidian. They were whispering in Korean, their eyes darting to the empty chair at the head of the table. When Colette entered, the whispers died a sudden, strangled death. The lead project manager, a man named Min, blinked rapidly. He looked at his tablet, then back at Colette. He had clearly expected the Western consultant to be a 30-something woman with a trendy bob and a desperate need to please. "Ms. Evans?" Min asked, his voice pitching slightly higher. "We were expecting you." "Then you aren't disappointed," Colette replied, her voice a rich, calm contralto. She didn't wait to be seated. She walked to the center of the table and slid her leather portfolio onto the glass. "Shall we begin the site integration analysis, or are we waiting for the air to finish thinning?" The door hissed open. The room didn't just go quiet. It went cold. Kang Ki-heon walked in. At 55, the CEO of JH Group was a study in lethal precision. His suit was bespoke, his movements were economical, and his face was a mask of granite. He was a man who lived in the now, exhausted by a world that constantly tried to sell him the new. His mother had spent the last year parading a succession of 25-year-old daughters of industry before him, women who smelled like vanilla and spoke in rehearsed platitudes. He was bored to the point of soul sickness. He didn't look at Colette at first. He sat down, flipped open a folder, and spoke in clipped, fluent English. "The seismic load-bearing specs for the North Pavilion are flawed. The restoration of the 14th century stonework cannot sustain the cantilevered glass roof. We scrap the cantilever, or we scrap the pavilion." The board members nodded frantically. Min began to stammer, "Yes, Chairman. The math suggests a 4.2% variance in—" "The math is wrong," Colette interrupted. The silence that followed was so absolute, You could hear the hum of the HVAC system. Kiheon's pen stopped moving. He slowly lifted his head. For the first time, his dark, sharp eyes landed on Colette. He didn't see a woman of a certain age. He saw a woman whose gaze didn't waver under his. He saw the silver in her hair and the terrifying intelligence in her eyes. "Excuse me?" Kiheon's voice was a low, dangerous rumble. Colette stood up and walked to the digital whiteboard. She swiped the screen, pulling up the blueprints. With a few deft strokes, she highlighted the intersection of the ancient granite base and the modern steel rafters. "You're calculating the load based on standard reinforced concrete," Colette said, her fingers dancing over the data points. "But this is 14th century Huangtu mortar. It's breathing masonry. If you use the cantilevered system with a 0.8 oscillation dampener, you aren't fighting the stone. You're using its natural elasticity." She scribbled a complex equation on the board, her hand steady. "The variance isn't 4.2%, she continued, turning to face him. "It's 1.1%. The structure won't just hold, it will be the most stable point in the entire complex. You don't need to scrap anything. You just need to stop treating the past like it's a burden and start treating it like a foundation." Kiheon stared at the board. Then he looked at her. The directors waited for the explosion. Kiheon was famous for tearing down anyone who dared to correct him in public. Instead, Kiheon leaned back in his chair. He studied the equation, then studied the woman who wrote it. He noticed the way she stood, shoulders back, chin up, completely unimpressed by his billion-dollar empire. She was seasoned. She was a master. A slow, almost imperceptible smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. This wasn't the malleable expert his board had promised. This was something he hadn't encountered in decades, an equal. "Mr. Min," Kiheon said, his eyes never leaving Colette's face. "Yes, Chairman?" "Clear my afternoon. Ms. Evans and I are going to the site. I want to see if her breathing masonry is as formidable as her tongue." He stood up, buttoning his jacket. He walked past Colette, stopping just close enough for her to catch the scent of sandalwood and a cold air. "Most people come to Seoul to get lost, Miss Evans," he said quietly. Colette met his gaze, her heart hammering a rhythm she hadn't felt in years, though her face remained a mask of professional calm. "I didn't come here to get lost, Chairman. I came here to build something that lasts." Kiheon nodded once. "Then let's see if you can handle the weight." The sky over Seoul had turned the color of bruised plums, and by the time Kiheon's black sedan reached the outskirts of the historic district, a steady, rhythmic rain had begun to fall. It wasn't the chaotic storm of a hurricane, but a persistent, meditative drizzle that turned the world gray and silver. Kiheon had dismissed his driver and his security detail, a move that had sent ripples of anxiety through his staff. But Kiheon didn't want an audience. He wanted to see if the woman sitting beside him was a fluke or a force of nature. They stepped out into the damp air of a secluded Hanak village, a cluster of traditional Korean houses with sweeping tiled roofs and wooden courtyards. "The wood here is original," Colette said, her voice cutting through the sound of the rain. She didn't wait for him to shield her with his umbrella. She walked toward a weathered gate, her eyes tracing the grain of the timber. 16th century. It's been treated with bean oil and tobacco water for 500 years. It doesn't need a coat of modern sealant. It needs to be allowed to sweat. Kiheon stood a few paces back, holding a large black umbrella. He watched her. Most women he knew would be complaining about their hair or their shoes. Most would be hovering close to him, trying to find a way into his proximity and his bank account. Colette Evans was halfway across a muddy courtyard, her expensive trousers ignored, her hand pressed against a pillar as if she were taking its pulse. "You're obsessed with foundations," Kiheon remarked, finally stepping closer to bring her under the shelter of the umbrella. "Foundations are the only things that don't lie," Colette replied, looking up at him. The humidity had made her silver streak curls L, framing her face in a wild, elegant halo. Everything else, the paint, the glass, the gold leaf, is just a performance. If the foundation is tired, the house is just a beautiful corpse. Kiheon felt a strange tightening in his chest. And are you tired? The question was too personal for a first-sight visit, but the rain had created a sanctuary, a bubble of real in a world of performative. Colette leaned back against the wooden pillar, her gaze turning toward the misty mountains in the distance. I've spent 30 years being the person everyone leans on. My daughter's strength, my employee's paycheck, my friend's moral compass. I was the pillar. And the thing about being a pillar, Chairman, is that no one ever asks if the pillar is cracked. They just keep adding weight. Kiheon stayed silent for a long moment. He knew that weight. He is the heir to a dynasty, the man who held 10,000 jobs in his hands. He was the Ice King, because if he melted, the whole empire would flood. My mother sends a different woman to my office every Tuesday, Kiheon said quietly, his voice blending with the rain. They are all beautiful. They are all 25. They are all perfect. And when they look at me, they see a throne. They don't see a man who hasn't slept through the night since 1998. He looked at Colette, really looked at her. He saw the faint lines at the corners of her eyes, lines earned from laughter and grief. He saw the stillness in her posture. She wasn't vibrating with the need for his approval. She was simply present. You have a peace about you, he admitted. It's louder than their youth. It's not peace, Colette corrected him, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. It's the realization that I have nothing left to prove to people who weren't meant to understand me anyway. The honesty was intoxicating. Kiheon felt a pull toward her that was physical, yes, but also intellectual and spiritual. He had spent his life surrounded by new things. He realized now that he had been starving for something enduring. We should head back, Kiheon said, though he didn't want to move. The path is slippery. As they turned to navigate the uneven stone walkway that led back to the car, Colette's heel caught on a moss-covered rock. She stumbled, her balance faltering. Kiheon's reaction was instantaneous. He dropped the umbrella's handle slightly to catch her, his large hand wrapping firmly around her forearm, while his other hand instinctively found the small of her back to steady her. The contact was like a lightning strike. Through the silk of her blouse, his palm was searingly hot. Colette gasped, her hand flying up to rest against his chest to steady herself. She could feel the hard, steady thrum of his heart beneath his bespoke suit. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. The rain drummed against the umbrella above them, a private percussion. Kiheon didn't let go. His fingers tightened slightly on her arm, his thumb brushing against the skin of her wrist. He didn't see an older woman. He saw the most captivating woman he had ever met. The chemistry wasn't the flighty, nervous spark of a teenager. It was the heavy, intentional heat of two adults who knew exactly what they were feeling and were terrified of how much they wanted it. I've got you, he whispered. Colette looked up into his dark eyes, seeing the ice melting into something molten and dangerous. I know, she breathed. She didn't pull away, and for the first time in a decade, she didn't feel like a pillar. She felt like a woman who was finally being seen. The amber room at the Shilla Hotel was a temple of gold leaf and predatory ambition. It was a strategic dinner, a term Kiheon used for events where he was expected to swallow his boredom in exchange for a smoother merger. Tonight, the merger was with the Han Seo Group, and the sweetener for the deal sat directly to his left, Min Ah. At 26, Min-Ah was a creature of the digital age. She was curated, filter-finished, and wore a dress that cost more than a mid-sized sedan and covered less than a silk scarf. Her skin was as smooth and unblemished as a new sheet of paper, and just as blank. She spent the first 20 minutes of the meal adjusting her ring light, a portable device her assistant had discreetly mounted to the table, and documenting her authentic experience for her 4 million followers. Colette sat across from them. She had been invited because the merger involved the very historic land her restoration project occupied. She wore a tailored black column dress with a high neckline, her only jewelry a strand of dark Tahitian pearls that caught the light like oil on water. "It's just so fascinating," Minar chirped, her voice like a high-pitched flute. She didn't look at Colette. She looked at the preview screen of her phone. "Having a senior consultant on the team, it's like having a living library. Tell me, Miss Evans, is it hard to keep up with the new software? Or do you prefer to draw everything with, what were they called? Pencils?" The table went silent. The Hanseo executives chuckled nervously. Kiheon's wine glass paused halfway to his lips. Colette took a slow, deliberate sip of her Cabernet. She didn't flush. She didn't look offended. She looked like a chess master who had just seen a toddler move a pawn into a trap. "I use both," Colette replied smoothly. "Software gives me the data, but the pencil gives me the soul. It's a matter of knowing the difference between a trend and a tradition." Minna pouted, a practiced expression she knew looked good on camera. "Tradition is just another word for old-fashioned, don't you think? Everything is so fast now. If you aren't the moment, you're basically invisible. I can't imagine being, well, in the sunset of my career. I'd be so scared of being forgotten." She leaned toward Kiheon, her hand fluttering near his arm. "Don't you agree, Kiheon? Energy is everything. Who wants to look at a dusty old building when you can build something brand new and shiny?" Kiheon didn't look at Minna. He didn't even acknowledge the hand near his sleeve. His gaze was anchored on Colette, his dark eyes hooded and unreadable. "The moment is a very crowded place, Minna," Colette said, her voice dropping into a register that commanded the entire room's attention. "It's loud, it's frantic, and it's remarkably short-lived. It's a flashbulb. It blinds you for a second, and then it's gone, leaving everyone in the dark." Colette leaned forward slightly, the golden light of the chandeliers catching the silver in her hair, making it look like spun platinum. "A legacy, however, is quiet," Colette continued. "It doesn't need a ring light to be seen because it has its own heat. It's the difference between a firework and a star. One is a performance for an audience. The other is a guide for the lost. At my maturity, as you put it, I've stopped caring about being the moment. I'm far more interested in being the foundation that survives the collapse of everything shiny." The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable for Colette. It was devastating for Minna. The younger woman looked around, waiting for someone to laugh or validate her. But the men at the table, the titans of industry, were looking at Colette with a new, sharp respect. Kiheon finally spoke. His voice was a low, vibrating chord of approval. "I've always found that the problem with shiny things," Kiheon said, his eyes still locked on Colette's, "is that they are usually hollow. They lack the structural integrity to withstand a real storm." He reached out. It was a deliberate public gesture. He didn't touch Minna. Instead, he reached across the corner of the table and placed his hand over Colette's, a heavy, warm, proprietary weight. "Ms. Evans isn't here to draw with pencils, Minna," Kiheon said, his tone final. "She is here because she is the only person in this room who understands that some things are too valuable to be replaced by the new." For the rest of the night, Minna became the ghost. She chattered. She pouted. She took 3 more selfies, but Kiheon was gone. He spent the entire evening inclined toward Colette, their conversation a private bridge built over the heads of everyone else. They talked about philosophy, about the grit of the city, about the exhaustion of excellence. As the dinner ended, Kiheon stood and held Colette's chair. A gesture of chivalry, he hadn't afforded anyone in years. Minna stood nearby, looking small and frantic in her expensive dress. Ki-hyun, we're going to that club in Itaewon, right? My followers are expecting a live stream. Ki-hyun didn't even turn his head. Go ahead, Minna. I have far more important matters to attend to. He turned to Colette, his expression softening into something that made the air in the room feel thin. The car is waiting, Colette. I believe we were discussing the tensile strength of the North Pavilion. I'd like to hear more, in private. As they walked out together, the seasoned expert and the Ice King, the room watched them with bated breath. Colette didn't look back at the moment she had just eclipsed. She was too busy walking toward her future. The phone on Colette's nightstand shrieked at 2:14 a.m., a jagged sound that tore through the silence of her corporate apartment. She was awake and reaching for it before the second ring finished. Evans, she said, her voice gravelly but alert. It's the drainage canal at the North Pavilion. Ki-hyun's voice came through the line, low and vibrating with a tension she hadn't heard before. The monsoon surge is heavier than the 50-year projection. The ancient retaining wall is weeping. If the pressure doesn't stabilize, we lose the foundation by dawn. I'll be there in 20 minutes, Colette said. She didn't ask if he was okay. She didn't ask why he was calling her instead of a site manager. They both knew why. 25 minutes later, Colette was whisked through the silent, shadowed corridors of JH Group headquarters. The building was a ghost of its daytime self, lit only by emergency floor lights. When she reached Ki-hyun's private executive suite, she found him not in a suit, but in a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, hunched over a sprawling digital map of the site. The Ice King looked human. His hair was slightly disheveled, and the shadows under his eyes gave him a rugged, weary handsomeness that made Colette's breath hitch. The site managers want to pump in quick-set resin, Ki-hyun said without looking up. They say it's the only way to plug the leaks. Colette walked to the table, leaning over the blueprints. If they do that, they'll suffocate the stone. The pressure will build up behind the resin and blow the entire wall out like a cork. No. She kicked off her black stiletto heels, the sound of them hitting the plush carpet a quiet rebellion. She stood bare feet, grounding herself against the floor. We don't plug it, we divert it. Ki-hyun finally looked at her. He watched her move, noticed the bare feet, and for a fleeting second, his eyes softened. He reached up, tugging at his silk tie, loosening it until it draped uselessly around his neck, before pulling it off entirely and tossing it onto a leather chair. Show me, he commanded, but the edge was gone, replaced by a quiet invitation. For the next 3 hours, the world ceased to exist. It was just the two of them, a sea of data, and the blue glow of monitors. They worked in a rhythmic, intuitive dance. Colette would bark out a calculation. Ki-hyun would pull up the corresponding geological survey. They argued over flow rates, whispered over topographical maps, and shared a singular focus that was more intimate than any dinner date. By 5:30 a.m., the site manager called. The diversion channels Colette had engineered on the fly had held. The pressure was dropping. The palace foundation was safe. Ki-hyun ended the call and let out a long, ragged exhale. The adrenaline that had sustained them began to ebb, leaving a heavy, charged stillness in the room. The first sliver of dawn was beginning to bleed through the Seoul skyline, painting the office in shades of bruised violet. We saved it, Ki-hyun said. He turned away from the monitors and walked to a hidden bar built into the mahogany shelving. He pulled out a heavy crystal decanter and 2 glasses. You saved it. We, Colette corrected, leaning back against the edge of his massive desk. She felt the fatigue in her bones, but she also felt a vibrant, humming electricity. Ki-hyun poured 2 fingers of an amber scotch that smelled of peat and old honey. He handed her a glass, his fingers lingering against hers as the handoff occurred. The touch was brief, but in the silence of the early morning, it felt like a shout. He didn't move away. He stood close enough for her to feel the heat radiating from his body, close enough to see the silver at his temples that mirrored her own. "I watched you tonight," Kiheon said, his voice dropping into a register that made Colette's heart thud against her ribs. He took a slow sip of his scotch, his eyes never leaving hers. "I watched the way you solve problems. You don't panic. You don't perform. You just exist in your own power." Colette smiled faintly, the scotch warming her throat. "It comes with the territory, Kiheon. When you've survived as much as I have, a little water in a basement doesn't scare you." Kiheon set his glass down on the desk behind him and stepped into her space. The no-nonsense CEO was gone. In his place was a man who looked like he was seeing a miracle for the first time. "They keep trying to give me new," he whispered, his hand rising as if to touch her hair, then hesitating. "My mother, my board, the world. They think I want a mirror of my success, or a trophy for my arm. They send me these girls who are like unread books, beautiful covers, but the pages are still blank." He finally let his hand settle on the curve of her jaw. His thumb traced the line of her cheek with an agonizingly slow pressure. "I've spent my life looking for a partner, Colette," he confessed, his dark eyes burning with a raw, terrifying honesty, "and everyone kept sending me children." Colette's breath hitched. She reached up, her hand covering his, pressing his palm firmly against her face. "I'm not a child, Kiheon." "I know," he breathed, leaning down until their foreheads touched. The air between them was thick with what-ifs, and the scent of expensive scotch, and the sudden, overwhelming realization that they were no longer alone in the world. "That's why I can't let you go." Outside, the sun finally broke over the horizon, but inside the darkened office, the only light that mattered was the fire between two people who had finally found someone who spoke their language. The following Friday, the Ice King did something that would have sent shockwaves through the JH Group executive floor. He closed his laptop at 6 p.m. "Put your coat on," Kiheon said, appearing at the door of the temporary office Colette had been assigned. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket. His charcoal vest clung to the broadness of his shoulders, and his sleeves were rolled up, revealing the strong, corded muscles of his forearms. Colette looked up from a schematic, a pair of reading glasses perched on the bridge of her nose. "We still have the seismic reports for the South Gate, Kiheon." "The South Gate has stood for 600 years. It can wait another 6 hours, he said, his voice dropping into that low, velvet register that always seemed to vibrate in her marrow. "I'm breaking my own rules tonight, Colette. No spreadsheets, no structural integrity, just us." He took her to a part of Hanam Dong where the streets were narrow and the shadows were long. They stopped before a heavy, unmarked bronze door. Kiheon pressed his palm to a scanner, and the door hissed open, revealing a staircase that descended into a world of mahogany, deep emerald velvet, and the sultry, low-frequency hum of a double bass. "My private sanctuary," he whispered as they descended. "Only 12 people in the world have the key." The club was nearly empty, save for a 3-piece jazz ensemble on a small circular stage, and a bartender who nodded once before disappearing into the back. The air smelled of expensive bourbon and the ghost of 1,000 late-night confessions. "You own a jazz club?" Colette asked, stepping into the dim, amber light. "I own a conglomerate," Kiheon replied, guiding her toward a semicircular booth. "I keep this club. It's the only place in Seoul where I don't have to be a chairman, where I can just be a man who likes the blues." They sat, and for an hour, they didn't talk about work. They talked about the songs they loved, the cities they had lonely memories in, and the strange, beautiful gravity that had pulled a woman from Connecticut and a man from Seoul into the same orbit. Ki-hyun watched her as she spoke, his gaze heavy and focused. He wasn't looking at her the way the men at the wedding had, as a puzzle to be solved or a tragedy to be pitied. He was looking at her like she was the last glass of water in a desert. On stage, the pianist began a slow, melancholic rendition of In a Sentimental Mood. Ki-hyun stood and held out his hand. Dance with me. Ki-hyun, there's no one else on the floor, Colette said, a rare flush creeping up her neck. Good, then they won't have to be jealous of me. She took his hand. He pulled her close. Closer than was professional. Closer than was safe. One of his hands splayed across the small of her back, his palm large and searingly warm, while the other interlaced its fingers with hers. They didn't dance like teenagers. There was no fumbling, no nervous distance. They moved with the synchronized grace of two people who understood the architecture of a body. Colette rested her head against his shoulder, her nose brushing the silk of his vest. He smelled of sandalwood and the cold night air. As they swayed, the world outside, the boardrooms, the younger rivals, the friends who thought she was finished, dissolved into insignificance. You fit, Ki-hyun murmured into her hair. His grip tightened, pulling her hips flush against his. I spent 30 years thinking I was too much for anyone to handle, too demanding, too cold. But with you, the silence isn't cold. It's full. Colette pulled back just enough to look at him. The silver in his hair caught the amber light, and his dark eyes were wide, honest, and stripped of all corporate armor. I was told I was past my prime, Ki-hyun, that I should learn to be content with being invisible. Ki-hyun's jaw tightened. The people who told you that are blind. You aren't in your sunset, Colette. You're the high noon. You have a fire in you that would incinerate those girls they try to foist on me. The music slowed, a final, lingering vibration of the bass strings. They stopped moving, but they didn't let go. The tension in the air was thick enough to touch, a physical weight that made it hard to breathe. Ki-hyun leaned in, his breath hot against her ear, his voice a rough, desperate growl. I don't want a consultant anymore, Colette. He pulled back, his hand migrating from her back to her nape, his fingers tangling in her silver-streaked curls. He searched her eyes for a second, looking for permission, and found a hunger that matched his own. He kissed her. It wasn't a tentative first kiss. It was deep, mature, and beautiful. It was the kiss of a man who had waited half a century to find his equal, and a woman who was reclaiming every ounce of her desire. It tasted of scotch and longing and the shattering of every no-nonsense rule Ki-hyun had ever made. In that dark, private sanctuary, as the city of Seoul hummed above them, Colette Evans realized that she wasn't just being loved. She was being worshipped by a king. And the best part? She knew she deserved it. The scandal didn't break with a roar. It began with a poisonous hiss. By Tuesday morning, grainy photographs of Ki-hyun and Colette leaving the jazz club, his hand possessively on her waist, their faces inches apart, had migrated from a blind item on a Korean forum to the tablets of every board member at JH Group. To the world, it was a mid-life lapse in judgment. To the board, it was a threat to the merger. Colette felt the shift the moment she stepped into the building. The hushed tones in the elevator, the way the receptionist looked at her feet rather than her eyes. She wasn't a heritage expert today. She was a distraction. She was halfway to her office when a woman in a Chanel suit, her face as immobile as a porcelain mask, intercepted her. The Dowager Chairwoman is waiting in the Sky Lounge. You will follow me. The Sky Lounge was a glass-walled sanctuary overlooking the Han River. At a low table sat Madame Kong, Ki-hyun's mother. At 75, she was the architect of the family's iron reputation. She didn't look up as Colette approached. She was busy pouring tea with a steady, practiced hand. "Sit," Madame Kang commanded. Colette sat. She didn't fidget. She didn't offer a polite greeting. She simply watched the older woman. "In Korea, we value the preservation of history," Madame Kang began, her voice like a thin blade. "But even history has its place. It belongs in a museum, under glass, where it can be admired without interfering with the progress of the future. My son is the future. You are a nostalgic detour." She reached into her Hermes handbag and pulled out a slim slip of paper. She slid it across the table. It was a cashier's check from a private bank. The number of zeros was enough to buy a small island. "This is 10 times your contract fee," Madame Kang said. "Pack your bags. Go back to America. Tell them you finished the job early. Leave him with his dignity, and I will let you keep yours." Colette looked at the check. She didn't feel the sting of tears. She didn't feel the shame Brenda or Susan would have expected her to feel. Instead, she felt a profound, weary clarity. She picked up the check between 2 fingers. "You think this is about money?" Colette said, her voice terrifyingly calm. "And you think my age is a vulnerability you can exploit." "It is a fact," Madame Kang snapped. "Ki-Heon needs an heir. He needs energy. He needs someone who isn't already finished." Colette leaned forward, her dark eyes flashing with a fire that made the dowager flinch. She slid the check back across the polished wood, not with anger, but with disdain. "You're evaluating me based on a shelf life I don't subscribe to," Colette said. "You see a woman who has expired. But Ki-Heon sees a woman who finally speaks his language. He isn't looking for an heir. He's looking for a reason to keep building. You offer him perfection. But perfection is boring, madame. Perfection is a mirror with nothing behind it. I'm the only thing in his life that he hasn't been able to buy, and that is why he won't let me go." "He will do as he is told." Madame Kang's voice rose, the porcelain mask finally cracking. "He is my son. He is a man," a new voice boomed. The glass doors hissed open. Ki-Heon stood there, his presence filling the room like a sudden storm. His eyes were cold, colder than Colette had ever seen them. But when they landed on her, they softened for a split second before turning back to his mother. He walked to the table and picked up the check. Without a word, he tore it in half, then half again, letting the scraps flutter onto the tea tray like snow. "Mother," Ki-Heon said, his voice vibrating with a dangerous low-frequency power, "you have spent your life managing mine as if it were a balance sheet. You think you are protecting the empire? You are suffocating it. Ki-Heon, this woman is—" "This woman," he interrupted, stepping behind Colette and placing his hands firmly on her shoulders. "A public, unshakable claim. Is the person I am choosing. Not for the merger, not for the cameras, for me." He looked down at Colette, his fingers squeezing her shoulders in a silent promise. "If the board wants to scandalize my personal life, let them," Ki-Heon said to his mother. "If the merger fails because I choose a partner of substance over a child of status, then it was a weak merger to begin with. But understand this, if you ever offer her a price for her absence again, you won't just lose a daughter-in-law. You will lose the chairman." Madame Kang looked at her son, then at the woman who had refused her millions. For the first time in her life, she saw a power she couldn't calculate. Ki-Heon didn't wait for a response. He leaned down, his face close to Colette's. "Let's go," he whispered. "We have a palace to build." As they walked out of the Sky Lounge together, Ki-Heon's hand never left the small of Colette's back. The board members in the hallway scrambled to move out of their way. The poor thing was gone. In her place was the woman who had just brought the Ice King to his knees and the empire to a standstill. The opening of the North Pavilion was not merely a corporate event. It was a cultural shift. Under a canopy of stars and the sharp geometric glow of the JH Group's new headquarters, The 14th century palace site glowed like a jewel unearthed from the mud. The breathing masonry Colette had championed stood firm, the ancient stone absorbing the modern light in a way that felt living, not dead. The world's architectural elite were there, murmuring in a dozen languages. But the focus wasn't on the building. It was on the woman who had saved it. Colette stood in the center of the pavilion, wearing a gown of liquid emerald silk that complemented the silver in her hair. She was being interviewed by Architectural Digest and the Global Heritage Fund simultaneously. The board members who had once whispered about her expiration were now elbowing each other to be seen in the background of her photographs. "Ms. Evans," a French critic remarked, "you've done the impossible. You've made the past feel inevitable. How did you know the stone would hold?" Colette caught Ki-Heon's eye across the crowd. He was leaning against a pillar, a glass of untouched champagne in his hand, watching her with an expression of such pure, unadulterated pride that it felt more intimate than a touch. "I didn't just look at the stone," Colette replied, her voice steady and resonant. "I looked at what it had survived. You don't bet against something that's already proven it can stand the test of time." The applause that followed was a roar, a public coronation. She wasn't the American consultant anymore. She was the architect of a legacy. 2 hours later, the noise of the city was replaced by the rhythmic thrum of a private jet's engines, and shortly after, the primal roar of the Pacific Ocean. Ki-Heon had whisked her away to his private villa on the southern coast of Jeju Island. The house was a masterpiece of basalt rock and floor-to-ceiling glass, perched on a cliffside where the waves crashed against the volcanic shore. The air in the villa was cool, scented with sea salt and the blooming tangerine trees nearby. Ki-Heon dropped his jacket on a low-slung leather sofa and turned to Colette. The polished Ice King exterior had finally fully cracked, leaving behind a man who looked hungry for the truth of her. "They couldn't take their eyes off you tonight," Ki-Heon said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration in the quiet room. Colette walked toward him, unpinning the emerald silk at her shoulder. "Is that why you brought me here? To hide me?" "No," Ki-Heon breathed, stepping into her space. He reached out, his hands framing her face, his thumbs stroking the high curve of her cheekbones. "I brought you here because I didn't want to share the victory. I wanted to tell you, without an audience, that I have never seen anything as magnificent as you standing in that pavilion." He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. "You aren't just my expert, Colette. You are my compass." The kiss that followed was no longer a question. It was an answer. It was a celebratory, fierce collision. When Ki-Heon's hands moved to the small of her back, pulling her flush against him, there was no hesitation. At 55, they weren't fumbling through the awkwardness of youth. They knew their bodies, they knew their desires, and they knew the value of the moment. He lifted her, her fingers tangling in his dark hair as they moved toward the expansive bedroom overlooking the sea. The intimacy was intense and unapologetic. It was the passion of two people who had spent decades building empires and were finally allowing themselves to be the center of one. Every touch was seasoned, every breath a shared language. Ki-Heon worshipped her, not as a fragile object, but as a formidable woman who had met his fire with her own. Later, as they lay together under a heavy silk duvet, the moonlight silvering their skin, the silence was comfortable, filled with the sound of the crashing waves below. "What happens now?" Colette whispered, tracing the lines on Ki-Heon's palm. "The project is over. My contract is up." Ki-Heon turned on his side, his dark eyes searching hers. He didn't look like a man thinking about settling down into a quiet retirement. He looked like a man who had just found the second half of a map. "The project isn't over," Ki-Heon said. "The pavilion was just the foundation. There is a whole world that needs to be rebuilt, Colette. I have the resources, and you have the vision." He kissed her shoulder, his grip tightening. Don't think of this as the end of a trip. Think of it as the end of the prologue. I've spent my life standing still, guarding what I had. I want to move now, with you. Colette looked out at the vast, dark horizon of the ocean. For years, she had felt like she was waiting for her life to conclude. Now she realized she was just getting to the good part. An adventure, she mused, the word tasting like freedom. An adventure, Kiheon confirmed, pulling the silk over them both. And this time, we aren't building for the ancestors. We're building for us. The cream-colored envelope sat on the reclaimed oak dining table in Colette's Seoul penthouse, like a dormant landmine. It was heavy, embossed with gold leaf, and smelled faintly of expensive cardstock and old money New York. The AIA, Global Excellence Gala. Colette stared at the calligraphy. Below the gala details, a familiar list of committee chairs was printed in smaller, elegant font. Brenda Sterling, Susan Miller Vane. Her phone chimed. It was a WhatsApp message from the Alumni Circle group chat, a thread she had muted months ago, but hadn't quite had the heart to leave. Brenda, Colette. We saw your name on the nominee list for the Soul Project. We were so shocked. We're all so glad you found a little something to keep you busy over there. You must come to the gala in NYC next month. We've reserved a spot for you at our table, right near the back where it's nice and quiet. We can finally talk about those retirement condos in the Hamptons. Colette felt a cold, familiar tightness in her chest. It was the invisible trigger. Despite the global acclaim, despite the fact that she had literally saved a piece of Korean history, Brenda's words still had the power to shrink her. In their eyes, she wasn't a world-class architect. She was still just the brave single woman who had run away to find a hobby because her clock had run out. She leaned back, the neon glow of the Seoul skyline reflecting in the window, feeling suddenly small. Maybe I shouldn't go, she thought. Why step back into the cage just to prove I can bend the bars? You're vibrating, a deep voice remarked. Kihyun stood in the doorway, his tie loosened, a bottle of sparkling water in one hand. He had become an expert at reading the micro-expressions on Colette's face. He walked over, his eyes dropping to the invitation and then to the glowing screen of her phone. Colette tried to flip the phone over, but he was faster. He read the message from Brenda. His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek, a telltale sign that the Ice King was reaching a boiling point. Nice and quiet, Kiheon repeated, his voice a low, dangerous growl. Retirement condos. It's just how they are, Kiheon, Colette said, sighing. She stood up and walked to the window, crossing her arms. To them, I'm a tragedy. If I go back there, I'll just be the poor thing again, only this time with a tan and a Korean souvenir. I don't want to be the ghost at their feast anymore. Kiheon walked up behind her. He didn't say anything at first. He simply wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. The heat of him was a physical anchor, grounding her. He rested his chin on her shoulder, their reflections merging in the glass. The silver-haired queen and the titan who adored her. You think they are the judges, Colette, he whispered into her ear. You think you are going back to ask for their permission to be happy. I'm not, she insisted, though her voice wavered. You are, he countered gently, because you are afraid that if you stand in that room, their version of you will become the truth again. You're afraid the ghost will return. He turned her around in his arms, forcing her to look into his dark, unwavering eyes. There was no professional coldness there now, only a fierce, protective devotion. We are going to New York, Kiheon stated. It wasn't a suggestion. But we aren't going so you can show them you've changed. Change implies you were broken before. You were never broken. He took her hand, his thumb tracing the knuckles that had sketched the future of his company. We're going back to show them they were wrong, he said, about you, about age, about what a woman like you deserves. I want to see Brenda's face when she realizes the woman she tried to downsize is the woman I would burn an empire to keep. Colette looked at him, the doubt in her heart beginning to dissolve, replaced by a spark of something sharp and vindictive. She thought of the eclectic table at the wedding. She thought of the pity in Brenda's eyes. They won't know what to do with you, Colette whispered, a small, wicked smile playing on her lips. They won't have to do anything with me, Kiheon replied, his eyes darkening with intent. They will simply have to stand back and watch us, because in that room, you won't be a guest, Colette. You'll be the sun, and I will be the man who traveled half the world just to be in your light. He leaned down and kissed her, a long, firm promise that sealed the deal. Colette picked up the invitation. She didn't look at the committee list this time. She looked at the date. I'll need a new dress, she said. Get 10, Kiheon replied. I'm bringing the private jet. We're landing in Manhattan, and we're taking the city by storm. The ghost was officially dead. The era of Colette Evans was about to go global. The penthouse terrace of the Carlisle Hotel was bathed in the crisp, unforgiving light of a New York autumn. It was the kind of setting designed to expose flaws, but as Colette Evans stepped onto the limestone tiles, she felt invincible. She wasn't wearing the safe, navy blue camouflage of her past. She wore a custom-designed piece from a boutique in Gangnam, a structured wrap front dress made of heavy, charcoal gray Korean silk that shimmered with threads of molten gold when she moved. The silhouette was a modern homage to the joggery, sharp and regal. Her silver hair wasn't pinned back in a practical bun. It was styled in soft, voluminous waves that caught the light, framing a face that no longer looked tired, but illuminated from within. At a circular table near the edge of the terrace, Brenda and Susan were already mid-mimosa. They looked exactly as they had 6 months ago, perfectly coiffed, heavily jeweled, and fundamentally stagnant. Colette? Brenda squinted, her glass hovering halfway to her lips. She stood up, her eyes performing a rapid-fire scan for signs of failure. Oh, darling, look at you. You've certainly picked up some local flair. Hello, Brenda. Susan, Colette said, her voice smooth and grounded. She sat down, not waiting for an invitation. We were so worried, Susan said, leaning in with that practiced predatory pout. When you just vanished, we thought, poor Colette, she's had a breakdown and run off to the Orient to find herself. Tell us, how was the little restoration job? Was it a nice hobby? I imagine it was quite peaceful, working with all those old things. It was many things, Susan, Colette replied, a ghost of a smile playing on her lips. Peaceful wasn't one of them. We were managing a $300 million integration of the North Pavilion. It required a bit more than a hobbyist's touch. Brenda chuckled, a condescending sound. Of course, dear. We're all so proud you kept busy. But really, isn't it time to come home? We found the most charming interior designer for that condo in Southport. You shouldn't be over there all alone at your age. It's a bit desperate, isn't it? Chasing a career when you should be settling into your twilight? Colette looked at Brenda, really looked at her, and realized she didn't feel anger. She felt a profound, distant pity. My twilight hasn't started yet, Brenda. I'm still enjoying the sun. Well, the sun sets eventually, Susan remarked snidely, and when it does, it's nice to have someone to hold the flashlight. But I suppose in Korea, you were just another face in the... The atmosphere on the terrace shifted. It wasn't a subtle change. It was a sudden drop in barometric pressure. The low hum of socialite chatter died an abrupt death. At the entrance to the terrace, 4 men in dark, razor-sharp suits appeared, their eyes scanning the room with professional detachment. They stood aside, creating a corridor of power. Then came Kiheon. He looked like a man who owned the horizon. In a charcoal three-piece suit that cost more than Brenda's SUV, he walked across the terrace with the effortless, predatory grace of a king. He didn't look at the view. He didn't look at the famous actress sitting 3 tables over. He didn't even acknowledge the gasp of recognition from the businessmen who knew exactly who the chairman of JH Group was. His eyes were locked on Colette. Brenda and Susan froze, their mouths literally hanging open as the Ice King approached their table. The security detail stopped 5 paces back, a silent wall of black wool and dark glass. Kiheon stopped beside Colette's chair. He didn't look at Brenda. He didn't look at Susan. He reached down and took Colette's hand in his large, warm palm a deliberate contrast to the coldness of the room. He didn't shake it. He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, his eyes never leaving hers. "You left the hotel without me," he said, his voice a low, intimate rumble that carried across the silent terrace. The car felt empty. Colette's heart did a slow, triumphant roll in her chest. "I didn't want to keep my friends waiting, Kiheon." Kiheon finally turned his gaze to Brenda and Susan. It was the look he used when he was about to liquidate a competitor. Cold, clinical, and utterly unimpressed. "Friends?" Kiheon asked, his tone making the word sound like a curiosity. He didn't offer his hand. He didn't smile. "I assume these are the women who told you your house was too big for you?" Brenda turned a shade of gray that matched her pearls. We, Mr. Kang, we had no idea. Colette doesn't brag about the things she owns," Kiheon said, his hand sliding possessively to the back of Colette's neck, his thumb brushing her skin in a way that shouted, "She is mine." "She only brags about the things she builds, and she has built something remarkable in soul." He looked back at Colette, his expression softening into something so tender it made Susan audibly gasp. "The gala committee is looking for you, Colette. They want to move your seating. Apparently, the eclectic table in the back was a clerical error. You're at the head table, with me." He stepped back, extending his arm in a formal, courtly gesture. "Shall we? I find the air up here is becoming a bit stale." Colette stood up. She didn't look at her mimosas. She didn't look at the 2 women who were now staring at her, as if she had just ascended to another dimension. "Enjoy the brunch, ladies," Colette said, her voice light and airy. "I'll see you at the gala. Or perhaps I won't. The head table is quite far from the back." As she walked away, tucked into the side of the most powerful man in the room, Colette didn't look back. She could feel the stares of every person on that terrace. The shock, the envy, the sudden frantic desire to be her friend. But for the first time in her life, the only gaze that mattered was the one from the man beside her. "You did well," Kiheon whispered as they reached the elevators. "I didn't do anything," Colette replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I just showed up." "That," Kiheon said, the elevator doors sliding shut on the stunned silence of the terrace, "is all you ever have to do." The Temple of Dendur at the Metropolitan Museum of Art was a cathedral of glass, sandstone, and shimmering water. Tonight, it served as the backdrop for the most prestigious architectural event of the year. The room was a sea of black ties and couture gowns, the air humming with the high-frequency vibration of wealth and influence. But the center of gravity had shifted. In previous years, Colette Evans would have been circling the perimeter, her face a practiced mask of fine, hoping for a lead on a mid-sized renovation project. Tonight, the perimeter came to her. Colette was a vision in molten gold, a floor-length silk gown that clung to her with liquid grace, featuring a high architectural collar that commanded respect. She moved through the crowd not like a guest, but like the host of the world itself. Brenda and Susan were there, hovering on the outskirts of her circle, their faces twisted into desperate, sycophantic smiles. They were no longer offering pity. They were offering business cards, hoping a drop of her new prestige might fall on them. "Colette, darling!" Brenda squeezed through a gap in the crowd, her voice a frantic trill. "We were just telling the AIA president how we always knew you had this in you. That house in Connecticut. We always said it was the house of a genius." Colette tilted her head, her dark eyes cool and amused. "Actually, Brenda, you said it was echoing and too big for a woman alone. But thank you for the revisionist history. It's almost as impressive as the masonry in Seoul." Before Brenda could sputter a response, a tall man with a thinning hairline and a sharp, bitter mouth stepped forward. It was Julian Vance, an architect who had once been Colette's peer and her most vocal critic. He had spent years winning contracts Colette was too old for. "It's a lovely fairy tale, Colette," Julian said, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of the surrounding elite. He looked at Kaheon, who was standing a few feet away, engaged in a conversation with the mayor. "But we all know how the industry works. A massive conglomerate needs a Western face for a project. A wealthy CEO decides to indulge in a temporary fascination with a seasoned expert. It's exotic. It's a nice story for the press." He stepped closer, his smile a jagged edge of jealousy. "Don't get too comfortable in that first-class seat, dear. A man like Kang Ki-heon is built for the long haul, but men like that eventually go back to the showroom for a newer model. You're a classic, sure, but classics usually end up in the garage once the novelty wears off." The circle went silent. The friends looked away, some hiding smirks, others waiting for the crash. Colette didn't flinch. She opened her mouth to speak, but the air in the room suddenly intensified. Ki-heon had stopped talking to the mayor. He had heard. He didn't rush over. He walked with a slow, terrifying intentionality. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. He stepped beside Colette, not to shield her, but to stand with her. He didn't even look at Julian. He looked at the room. A chime rang out. The signal for the night's keynote toast. The AIA president gestured to the microphone. "Chairman Kang, if you would favor us with a few words." Ki-heon stepped onto the dais. He adjusted the microphone, his dark eyes scanning the room until they landed on Julian, then finally, softly, on Colette. "Tonight, we celebrate architecture," Ki-heon began, his voice a deep, resonant bell that silenced every whisper. "We celebrate the ability to see what isn't there and the strength to build it. Many of you have approached me tonight to congratulate me on my find. You speak of Miss Evans as if she were a lucky discovery or a fascination of the moment." He paused, the silence in the Temple of Dender absolute. "I want to correct the record," Ki-heon continued. "When I met Colette Evans, I was a man who had everything and felt nothing. I lived in a world of newer models, of people who were polished but hollow, beautiful but temporary. I was surrounded by a world that values the now over the forever." He looked directly at Brenda, then at Julian, his gaze stripping them bare. "Many of you in this room saw a woman who was alone. You saw her as a ghost, a poor thing whose time had passed. You pitied her because you couldn't reach her height. You mistook her peace for loneliness and her wisdom for expiration." Ki-heon stepped down from the podium, walking toward Colette until he was inches from her. He took the mic with him. "I did not find Colette," he said, his voice dropping into a register of raw public devotion. "I earned her. I spent months proving to her that I was worthy of her brilliance. She didn't need my empire. She didn't even need my heart. She was already whole." He reached out, taking Colette's hand and lifting it for the entire room to see. "She is not my temporary fascination. She is my partner, my equal, my home. And for those of you waiting for the novelty to wear off," he looked at Julian, his eyes like flint, "you will be waiting for the rest of your lives, because I don't trade in moments. I build legacies, and she is the greatest one I will ever know." He raised his glass. To the woman who was never left behind. To the woman who was simply waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. The applause didn't just break. It shattered the room. It was a standing ovation that lasted minutes. Julian withered into the shadows. Brenda and Susan stood frozen, their social currency having just hit zero. Colette stood in the center of the storm, tears pricking her eyes, not of sadness, but of a cleansing, fiery vindication. She looked at Cahaon, the man who had seen her when she was invisible, and she realized he was right. God hadn't forgotten her address. He was just preparing the house for the king. The morning after the gala, the sun rose over Central Park in a haze of amber and gold. But for the first time in 30 years, Colette Evans didn't check her reflection for new lines of worry. She sat on the terrace of the Carlisle suite, a cup of black coffee in her hand. Her phone, resting on the wrought iron table, was a frantic hive of activity. Notifications from the alumnae circle were popping up like bubbles in a boiling pot. Brenda, Colette, we're doing a post-gala brunch at Sarah Beth's. You have to bring the chairman. We have so much to catch up on. Susan, I'm so sorry about what Julian said. He's always been jealous. We're your real friends, honey. Call us. Colette watched the messages with a detached, clinical sort of interest. 6 months ago, these pings would have been her lifeline. She would have spent an hour crafting the perfect, self-deprecating response to ensure they still liked her, still included her, still saw her as one of them. Now they looked like static, noise from a radio station she no longer tuned into. She picked up the phone. She didn't type a reply. She didn't send a mic drop text. She simply navigated to the group settings and hit delete and exit. Then, she blocked the numbers of the women who had spent a decade trying to convince her she was shrinking. The silence that followed was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. You're quiet, Cahaon said, stepping out onto the terrace. He was dressed for travel, a navy cashmere sweater and dark trousers, looking relaxed and remarkably younger than he had when she first met him. I just realized I don't have to carry them anymore, Colette said, looking up at him. The people who knew me when I was small. I don't need their well done. I don't even need their apology. Cahaon leaned against the railing, looking out at the skyline. Validation is a poor foundation for a life, Colette. It's better to build on something solid. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a leather-bound folder. He didn't hand it to her. He laid it on the table between them. What's this? More seismic reports? She teased. A new blueprint, he said, his voice turning serious. JH Group is restructuring. We are launching a global division. Evans Kang International. It's a firm dedicated to the intersection of heritage restoration and sustainable futurism. Colette opened the folder. Her eyes widened as she saw the articles of incorporation. Her name wasn't listed as a consultant. It wasn't listed as a director. Co-CEO, she whispered, her heart skipping a beat. I don't want you in my shadow, Colette, Cahaon said, stepping closer, his hand coming to rest on her shoulder. And I certainly don't want you back in New York taking hobby contracts to fill the time. I want your mind at the head of the table. I want your signature on every deal. I want the world to know that when they hire us, they are hiring two halves of a whole. He looked at her with an intensity that was purely professional and deeply personal all at once. This isn't a gift, it's a merger. I need your vision to keep my empire from becoming a museum. Will you build it with me? Colette looked at the documents, then at the man who had seen her in the dark and called her the light. She picked up a pen and signed her name, not with the hesitant script of the woman at the wedding, but with the bold, decisive strokes of a woman who knew her worth. Let's go home, Cahaon, she said. 2 months later. Seoul. The sun was setting over the Han River, painting the city in shades of electric blue and burning orange. The North Pavilion project was complete, a glowing beacon of history in the heart of a digital city. Colette and Kiheon stood on the private observation deck of their new joint headquarters. The wind whipped through Colette's silver hair, but she didn't pull back. She stood at the very edge of the glass railing, looking down at the city she had once found indifferent. It wasn't indifferent anymore. It was her canvas. Kiheon stepped up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. They stood together, two titans at the peak of their power, unbothered by the gravity of age. I remember thinking God forgot my address, Colette murmured, leaning back into his strength. I thought I was settling down. I thought I was supposed to be quiet now. Kiheon turned her in his arms, his eyes reflecting the neon glow of the city they had helped build. He looked at her not as a woman in her twilight, but as a woman in her prime, vibrant, powerful, and utterly soared. They told you that your time had passed, Kiheon said, his voice a low, triumphant rumble. Colette smiled, a radiant, fierce expression that could have lit the city on its own. They did. Kiheon leaned down, his lips brushing hers in a promise of 1,000 tomorrows. They were right, he whispered against her mouth. Your time passed, and your era began. As the lights of Seoul flickered on one by one, Colette Evans didn't look back. She didn't have to. She was finally, perfectly, exactly where she was meant to be. The end. Thank you for watching. If you loved this story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more emotional twists and character-driven plots. And if you're ready for the next story, make sure to turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Until next time, keep believing in love that defies all odds.